On the day of our 50th wedding anniversary, my husband took his mistress to pick out a burial plot. Her name is Celeste Monroe, the so-called first love he's never been able to forget. They posed for a photo on the cemetery lawn, standing in front of a headstone carved with a shared epitaph. Then they posted it on social media. The caption was identical on both accounts. "We couldn't share a bed in life, but we'll share a grave in death." In the picture they smiled like two lovers finally reunited after a lifetime apart. A perfect portrait of bittersweet romance. The comments section flooded with praise and sentiment. Fate was too cruel, but love found its way in the end. The old professor finally reunited with his true love. Even my son Julian chimed in, "Dad, I'll make sure your wish comes true someday. You and Celeste deserve it." My heart twisted when I read his words. Still I tapped like. Then I quietly walked back to the dining room and began clearing away the anniversary dinner I had spent the whole day preparing. Dish by dish, straight into the trash. When the garbage bag was full, I took it downstairs and fed the stray dogs at the corner. Back in the kitchen, the air still smelled faintly of roasted meat and warm spices. But all I could feel was the hollow ache of disappointment. 50 years of marriage, and in the end I lost to his old good memory. I had just scraped the entire dinner into a garbage bag, planning to feed the strays around the neighborhood later. The dishes were still sitting on the counter, untouched, when the front door suddenly swung open. Richard was back. I was caught off guard. On a day like this, a day he should have considered worth celebrating, I'd assumed he'd be off somewhere with Celeste, clinking champagne glasses and watching the sunset. Maybe the confusion in my eyes was too obvious, because he looked away awkwardly and said in that half-hearted tone of his, "Celeste thought you might be upset. She asked me to come back and comfort you." My lips twitched, but I didn't say a word. So, it wasn't because he remembered what today was. Not because guilt finally caught up with him. Just another thoughtful gesture from Celeste. He stepped into the kitchen, eyes scanning the empty table and the trash bag filled with food. His face immediately darkened. "You made all this just for yourself and threw it away? Must be nice living such a wasteful life. Have you completely forgotten how to be frugal?" That familiar tone, condescending, cold, like a professor scolding an ignorant student from his podium, hit me like a reflex. He's always spoken to me that way. For 50 years he's been handing out lectures, never once bothering to ask why or how. But oddly enough, he's never like that with anyone else. With others he's gentle, courteous, even charming, especially with Celeste. Always soft-spoken. Always kind. For a long time I told myself it was because he felt closer to me, more comfortable. But today it finally hit me. It wasn't intimacy. It was indifference. You don't speak that way to someone you love. You criticize what you no longer care for. You raise your voice at what you've already given up on. If it had been the old me, I might have tried to explain that the dinner wasn't just for me. That I cooked for the whole family because today marked 50 years of marriage. 50 years. Meant to symbolize something golden, something lasting. I spent an entire month planning the menu, hoping we'd all gather around the table just this once. I'd been out since morning, shopping, cooking, making everyone's favorite dishes. And for what? No one showed up. Not even a phone call. For a moment I even allowed myself to believe they might be planning a surprise. But all I got was a photo on social media, and a poetic caption about sharing a grave that they will never part each other again. All those explanations I had lined up dissolved on my tongue. My voice came out cold and even. I bought the groceries. I cooked the food. What I do with it is my business. Not yours. Richard frowned, his expression instantly sharpening. "So you are throwing a tantrum. We're talking about being buried together after we die, not living together now. Why are you being so petty? I've been with you for 50 years. Doesn't that count for anything? Celeste waited for me her entire life, never once complained. All she's asking for is a symbolic gesture after death. Is that really so hard for you to accept?" The way he said it, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, made me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. And for a second I almost doubted myself. Was I really being too sensitive? But then I thought, what exactly have I done wrong in this marriage? How did I become the one who needed to reflect? I looked him straight in the eye, my voice calm, but every word a slap across the face. The ones in the wrong are you, a cheating old man, and her, a so-called lover who kept inserting herself into someone else's marriage. And you have the nerve to call me small-minded. His expression turned instantly stormy, the air between us thick with tension. There's nothing going on between me and Celeste. Our relationship has always been innocent. Don't you dare use such vulgar language to insult her. He paused, then spoke again, sharper this time. She only asked me to come back because she was worried you'd have an emotional breakdown. Honestly, given how bitter you've become, her kindness was completely wasted. You don't even know what basic decency looks like anymore. With that, he let out a cold huff, grabbed the door handle and snapped, "You can sit here and reflect on yourself. I won't be coming back for a few days." The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the apartment. Silence settled over the room. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Richard never came back. Days passed and he didn't step foot in the house once. But I knew exactly where he was. Celeste's social media had become a daily calendar of their love story. Sunrise by the ocean. Sunset atop a mountain. A heart-shaped padlock fastened to the lovers' bridge. Every photo showed them pressed close together, smiling like newlyweds. The comments were all glowing tributes. This is true love, a bond untouched by time. Not one mention of me, the legal wife of 50 years. And what was I doing during those days? I wasn't idle. I started asking around about divorce. Quiet conversations with friends, reaching out for advice. But every time I brought it up, people looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Evelyn, you're over 70. Divorce? No. You've tolerated this for most of your life. Can't you just keep tolerating it a little longer?" As if women my age had no right to choose a different life. As if once we grow old our only purpose is to endure. Even Julian came by, bringing Margot and little Leo with him, as if turning it into some kind of family intervention. He said they were visiting, but it felt more like a tribunal. The moment he stepped inside, his face was laced with impatience. He sent Leo off to the backyard before launching into it. "Mom, I honestly don't get what you're doing. Dad and Celeste haven't done anything inappropriate. They're just old friends. Do you have to make such a big deal out of this? Can't you be more mature? And don't forget, if it weren't for Celeste stepping aside back then, you wouldn't have married Dad in the first place. She gave you this life. You should be grateful. You've been fine all these years and now you want a divorce over a grave plot? That's ridiculous." He paused for a moment, then added, as if trying to sound reasonable, "Look, they just want some symbolic closure. They missed their chance in life. Now they're just seeking comfort in death. Isn't that understandable? And if you go through with this divorce, what do you think it'll do to Dad's reputation? He's a well-known university professor. How would that look? Even if you don't care about him, think about me. Just think it through, okay, Mom?" The longer he spoke, the colder my heart grew. This son I raised with my own 2 hands, all he seemed to care about was appearances, legacy, reputation. Not a shred of empathy for his mother. And sadly, he hadn't forgotten that I'd tolerated things for his sake before. I nearly died bringing him into this world. And the day after he was born, I saw Richard and Celeste clinging to each other in the hospital hallway, sobbing in each other's arms. Celeste had just finalized her divorce and came to seek comfort from Richard. She knew I'd just given birth, yet wrapped herself around him without hesitation. Richard didn't even try to create distance. He started visiting her constantly, leaving me alone in the hospital, barely saying a word to me. I was furious. Julian was barely a month old when I first brought up divorce. But both my mother and Richard's mother said the same thing. For the child's sake, just endure it. I looked down at the tiny bundle in my arms and bit back my pride. I stayed. As Julian grew, there were countless times when I was tempted to leave. Every time Richard and Celeste blurred the lines between old friends and something more. But each time Julian begged me to stay. "Mom, please don't get divorced. I don't want to be the kid from a broken family." And I gave in. Over and over again. Decades of patience, sacrifice, silence. For him. And now this son, this boy I gave my life to, was standing here, cutting me down with the coldest words imaginable. I never asked him to take my side. But he, of all people, shouldn't have been the one to hurt me the most. This time I didn't waver. I looked at him, my voice steady, each word slicing through the air like a blade. Who decided that because I tolerated it for most of my life I have to tolerate it until I die? You said it yourself. How many years do I have left? So tell me, why shouldn't I spend what time I have left finally living for myself? Julian's face hardened, so much like his father's it almost startled me. I can't believe how selfish you've become. You want a divorce? Fine. Then don't ever consider me your son again. And in that moment I felt the last thread tying me down quietly snap. And strangely it felt like freedom. Julian meant what he said. After that final threat he cut off all contact. But I, at long last, found someone who truly listened. Her name was Sylvie Hartley. A young woman in her 20s, a ceramic artist who also worked part-time as a lawyer. When I spoke she didn't give me that usual look of disbelief. Instead, her eyes held nothing but admiration. Evelyn, honestly, I admire you so much. People love to say women your age shouldn't stir the waters anymore, but I think leaving the wrong person is never too late. She told me about her grandmother, a woman who spent her whole life trapped in a loveless marriage, never once tasting the freedom she deserved. If my grandma had even half your courage, Sylvie said, smiling gently, her life would have been completely different. She promised she'd help me. It wasn't long before Sylvie drafted the divorce papers. I sent the agreement to Richard. And as expected he called. His voice carried that same old sneer, laced with mockery and contempt. Really, Evelyn? This again? After all these years, you still think divorce threats are going to make me come crawling? Can't you come up with something new? You'd be better off admitting you were wrong. Who knows, if I'm in a good mood maybe I'll come home. Why bother with this charade? He thought it was just another bluff. That I'd cave like I always had. That a few sharp words would have me backing down, swallowing my pride and falling back in line. He had no idea that this time I was done. The agreement is clear. The house stays with me. I'll pack your things. Come get them when you want. If you have issues with any terms, we can discuss them over the phone. I didn't waste another word. I hung up. Now that the decision was final, I couldn't stand the sound of his voice. I began packing his clothes one piece at a time. As the room slowly emptied, a strange calm settled over me. Half a century of marriage, and everything in this house that belonged to him, I had picked out myself. But when the packing was done I realized something startling. There was almost nothing here that truly belonged to me. For decades I lived for Richard, for Julian, for my grandson Leo. I bought whatever they liked without hesitation. But when it came to myself, even buying a new dress felt like a guilty indulgence. Richard used to call me stingy. Julian said I was tight-fisted. But neither of them ever understood. I just never allowed myself to spend on me. It didn't matter anymore. From now on this house would slowly fill with things I chose for myself. The books I once loved but never bought. The soft armchair I always imagined sitting in. The clothes that made me feel beautiful. No more walking on eggshells. No more asking permission to live. I thought Richard would take at least a day to come pick up his things. But that very night the front door opened and there he was. When he saw his belongings packed neatly and waiting by the door, something flickered across his face. Panic. For the first time in decades, I saw genuine unease in his eyes. But it passed quickly, swallowed by his usual sarcasm. Well, you're really putting on a show this time. I'll admit, it almost feels real. I looked at the man I'd spent a lifetime with and felt nothing but stillness inside me. He never understood me. More accurately, he never even tried. I'm not putting on a show, Richard, I said calmly, like I was stating the weather. I'm serious. This marriage is over. You're finally free to spend eternity with Celeste. No regrets left, right? I thought I had made myself clear. But he just scoffed and curled his lip into a smirk. In the end, it's just jealousy, isn't it? Every time Celeste and I get close, you pull out this divorce act. You think I don't see through it? We're too old for these games. You really think I'll keep tolerating this? Push me hard enough and I'll give you exactly what you want. Then let's see how you handle the rest of your life. Alone. He was still convinced it was all performance. That I was trying to manipulate him one more time. I didn't argue. I just looked at him steadily and said, slow and firm, Richard, I mean it. I want a divorce. His smile froze. For the first time in years he didn't have a snappy comeback. He just stood there staring at me in silence. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. All this over a burial plot? He finally said, his voice low and tight. Men are always like this. They think a woman's decision to leave is triggered by something small, something trivial. They never understand that a woman's heart doesn't die in a single moment. It's buried under years of quiet disappointment. I had no desire to explain anymore. Sure, I replied calmly. If that's what you want to believe. His expression soured, frustration creeping into his voice. I told you, it's just a way to fulfill a dream for Celeste. Do you really have to be this petty? She and I have been nothing more than friends all these years. Isn't that enough for you? I almost laughed. Every time I questioned his relationship with Celeste, he'd fall back on that same excuse. Just friends, nothing happened. And every time I let it go. As long as they hadn't crossed that final line, I'd pretend not to see. I let myself believe there was still something left worth preserving. But now I knew better. I'd been betraying myself for far too long. And if I kept playing dumb, I'd be complicit in the slow murder of my own life. I lowered my gaze briefly, then lifted it again, steady and clear. Richard, emotional infidelity is still infidelity. Can you honestly say, even for a single moment in all these decades, that your heart ever fully belonged to me? All these years, one word from Celeste and you'd drop everything to be by her side. But what about me? When I needed you the most, where were you? My voice slowed, every sentence striking like a hammer. When our child was burning with fever, I carried him through the rain to the ER in the middle of the night, while you stayed with Celeste because she was scared of thunder. When your mother was on her deathbed waiting to see you one last time, I called you dozens of times, but you wouldn't answer because Celeste had just finalized her divorce and was feeling fragile. How many moments like that were there in 50 years? Can you even count them? Can you really look me in the eye and say nothing ever happened between you and her? Richard was silent. His mouth opened slightly but no words came out. I looked at him feeling no anger, no sorrow, only a strange stillness. Everything I'd carried inside for years, bitterness, hurt, regret, was finally out in the open. And just like that it was gone. For the first time in my life I felt solid beneath my feet. I could breathe again. And I even found it in myself to say with surprising gentleness, if you and she still carry regrets, then go. Be together while you're still alive. Life's short. Love who you want. Don't waste another second. Richard stared at me like he didn't recognize me. He watched me for a long time before letting out a faint, bitter laugh. Evelyn, I never realized you've been holding so much in all these years. It was the first time in a very long time he looked at me, really looked at me. But instead of feeling seen, I just felt tired. Resentment? Of course there was resentment. Our marriage had been arranged by our parents. First I had hope. After all, Richard was considered a catch, educated, well-mannered, respectable. If not for the matchmaking, I probably wouldn't have crossed paths with someone like him. But within a month of the wedding, I knew he'd never truly been mine. He had fought his entire family to marry Celeste once, went on a hunger strike, threatened to cut ties with his parents. But they had stood their ground, refusing to accept her, even threatening their own lives. When Celeste eventually married a wealthy businessman, Richard gave up and married me instead. Not out of love, out of resignation. When I learned all this, I doubled down on trying to be the perfect wife. I ran the household, cared for his parents, did everything right, hoping one day he'd turn around and see me. But I finally understood. Some men spend their whole lives chasing the ghost of what they never had. And no matter how hard I tried, I could never compete with a memory. I was done competing. That resentment, it's already in the past, I said, voice light, almost casual. Now I just want to move forward. Even if I only have one day left, I'm going to live it fully. Let's get divorced. Richard stood there, expression tangled, like my words had knocked the wind out of him. When he left that night, it was almost as if he fled. And I couldn't quite understand it. Wasn't this what he always wanted? To be free, to be with Celeste? I had given him that freedom. Shouldn't he have felt relieved? But instead he disappeared. Days went by. No visits, no phone calls. And not a single word about the divorce. I wasn't in a rush. Everything had already been laid bare. The rest was just a matter of time. These past few days I'd already begun living a kind of post-marriage life. No more endless housework. No more obligations to care for a husband. No more watching the clock to make sure I was home in time for dinner. Suddenly I had time, real, unstructured, beautiful time. I slept in every morning, drank my coffee slowly, took long walks, wandered through bookstores and weekend markets. Life was quiet but light. Unburdened. Even better, I'd formed an unexpected friendship with someone I never imagined. Sylvie Hartley, the young woman who'd helped draft my divorce papers. In her 20s, Sylvie was everything her name suggested. Gentle, sincere, and sharp-eyed. She invited me to a community pottery class, saying clay had a way of calming the soul. I joined out of curiosity, not expecting much. But to my surprise, I fell in love with it. Really in love. The feeling of shaping raw earth into a cup, a bowl, a lampshade, it was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 70-plus years. The instructor praised my touch, said I had a natural sense for balance and form. In just a few short classes, I'd received more encouragement and recognition than I had in decades worth of birthdays, anniversaries, and Mother's Days combined. I started to feel like I was being reborn. Even Celeste looked taken aback when she saw me again. And I couldn't blame her. In the past, I'd always seemed like a shadow beside her. She was immaculately groomed, tailored dresses, perfect makeup, polished nails in fashionable colors. At 70, she looked barely over 50. Me. I wore loose, faded clothes. My hands were rough, calloused, always half hidden in my sleeves when she was around. I didn't want to be seen next to her. But now I stood tall. And I let those time-worn hands show. Hands marked by decades of hard work, hands I no longer felt ashamed of. They were proof I'd lived. They were my medals. I smiled at her without flinching, without shrinking. I'd finally become a woman who no longer needed to be approved of. I thought you'd be a mess these days, Celeste said, feigning casualness, but the bitterness in her voice was impossible to miss. But you actually look pretty comfortable. I let out a soft laugh. Not bad. Then she said it, the real reason for her visit. I heard you're going through another one of your divorce tantrums with Richard. He asked me to come and talk to you. She paused, then added with a smirk, but honestly, what's there to explain? After all these years, hasn't it been obvious who he really loves? She tilted her head, voice syrupy with condescension. I just don't get it. What are you trying to achieve with all this? After so many decades, do you really think a divorce will win him back? That's a little sad, don't you think? Even if you guilt him into coming home, it won't be love. You do know that, don't you? That smug, self-righteous tone, that educated superiority she and Richard always wore like a badge. They believed their degrees gave them license to lecture, to belittle, to assume they always knew better. But education doesn't equal decency. And class has nothing to do with kindness. I smiled, calm and sharp as glass. You're right, I could never match your skill. 3 divorces and still managing to stay unforgettable in a man's heart? That's an art I've never mastered. Her face faltered for a split second. I went on, gently twisting the knife. Instead of showing off here, maybe go tell Richard to sign the divorce papers. That way you can finally marry him and get that title you've been chasing all these years. Otherwise, when you two are buried side by side, everyone will just say, he buried his mistress in the family plot. What a tragic little irony, don't you think? No amount of flawless makeup could mask the crack in her expression. You're vulgar and ignorant, she snapped, rising to her feet, shaking with rage. You don't understand the love Richard and I share. You've never known real love in your life. The one who's never been loved, that's the real outsider. She turned to storm out, but stopped cold in her tracks at the door. Richard was standing there, his eyes dark, unreadable. Celeste froze, her body stiffening, visibly shaken. She took a step back, her confidence evaporating in an instant. And Richard, his face was tight with fury. I asked you to help and come explain things, he said, voice cold. That's how you chose to do it? I never thought I'd live to see the day Richard turned cold on Celeste. And clearly neither did she. Her eyes brimmed with disbelief, wounded pride slipping into desperation. Richard, are you blaming me? Her voice trembled. What did I say that was so wrong? All these years, you've never had the courage to admit that I'm the one you truly love. If she wants a divorce, then let her go. I don't understand what you're still hesitating about. Didn't you say your only regret in life was not being with me? So what am I to you then? She was unraveling, her voice cracking with emotion, nearly on the edge of tears. And Richard, the man who'd once held her on a pedestal, softened. His hand twitched, reaching for her instinctively, but when his gaze flicked to me, he froze mid-motion. Celeste, you don't understand, he said quietly. Evelyn has given so much to me over the years. I can't just hurt her like that. His voice was low, pained, meant to sound noble, conflicted. But to me it was nauseating. Richard, I said, standing up, my voice like ice, please spare me the sanctimonious guilt trip. You still don't get it, do you? You wanted everything, and in the end you'll be left with nothing. You say you don't want to let me down, but hasn't it been you all along handing me disappointment after disappointment? You claim to love Celeste, so how many chances have you had to leave me and be with her? Decades worth. But you never did. You clung to both of us, afraid to lose either, too cowardly to choose. Now we're all old and still you're stuck, hurting me, draining her. You don't see how pathetic that is. You were never a man of principle, Richard. Just a man too afraid to make a choice. Richard stood there, stunned, staring at me as if I were someone he no longer recognized. He didn't say a word. I looked at the two of them, one a spineless old man, the other a woman still chasing a fantasy, and suddenly I felt nothing. No bitterness. No anger. Just a profound sense of clarity. I picked up my bag, turned my back and walked out. That night Richard called. His voice was low, weary, tinged with something that might have been guilt. He said he was ready to divorce. When I heard those words I didn't feel sadness. I felt something closer to relief. A long, full breath after years of suffocating silence. The next day we signed the divorce papers. That single sheet of paper felt like a key, finally unlocking the cage I'd been trapped in for most of my life. We filed at the courthouse that afternoon. But what I didn't expect was this. The very next day Richard and Celeste registered their marriage. So swift it felt rehearsed, as if they'd been waiting backstage for the curtain to rise. What came next was almost laughable. Julian sent me a video. Footage of a candlelit family dinner. Glasses clinking, smiles all around. A celebration. In the video he raised his glass and called Celeste Mom. My grandson Leo, the boy I'd helped raise, beamed up at her and chirped, "Pretty grandma." And at the end of the video, Julian looked into the camera and said, "This is what you wanted, right? Take a good look, Mom. Now your husband, your son, your grandson, all belong to someone else. Happy now?" I didn't reply. That little performance, his childish attempt at a victory parade, wasn't worth my time. But he must have assumed I was stewing in regret. Because after that he began flooding me with pictures, videos, messages. Snapshots of Celeste arranging flowers, laughing gently, reading by the window, helping Leo with his homework. "She's so thoughtful," he wrote. "So poised. Not like you, always nagging." I watched it all for a few days, then stopped wasting my energy. I blocked him. Deleted his number. Silenced his name. And just like that I let him go too. As far as I'm concerned, I never had a son. Life after divorce turned out to be more liberating and fulfilling than I had ever imagined. I continued my pottery classes, sinking deeper into the quiet joy of shaping clay. There was something sacred about it. How, in complete silence, your hands could mold something from nothing. It wasn't just art. It was healing. Sylvie encouraged me to start documenting my work. She helped me take photos and videos, even taught me how to create a social media account and upload my pieces online. At first the comments weren't kind. "You really have the nerve to post this? What a boring way to spend your life." But I didn't let it bother me. I wasn't doing this for anyone else. I was doing it for me. What I was documenting wasn't just pottery, it was transformation. Every piece I made marked another step forward. It was the first time in my life I'd ever committed to something just for myself. Little by little my skills improved. My pieces became more refined. And slowly the comment section began to shift. People began to notice the detail in my hands. Some said my cups had soul. Others wrote things like, "Grandma, you look like you're glowing when you're working with clay." And one day as I scrolled through the comments under a short video of me trimming the rim of a freshly thrown bowl, I saw a familiar name. "Richard. Beautiful work. You look radiant when you're creating." I stared at it for a moment, then typed a simple reply, "Thank you." I didn't expect anything more. It was just a polite, neutral response. I thought that would be the end of it. But that one comment unexpectedly sparked yet another war. Ever since marrying Richard, Celeste had developed a habit, checking his phone. The moment she saw that comment he'd left on my video, she completely lost control. She accused him of clinging to his past, of never truly letting me go. Said he was emotionally cheating. Richard tried to explain, claimed we hadn't even seen each other in months, that it was just a friendly compliment, nothing more. But Celeste didn't buy it. She latched onto her suspicions, insisting he'd been watching my videos obsessively, claiming, "Even the way you look at the screen is different now." Their argument escalated quickly. And what I never expected was that Celeste would storm into my pottery class at the community art center. We hadn't seen each other in months, but in that moment, everything about us had reversed. She looked worn, dressed in a dull, shapeless house sweater, her flawless makeup gone, nail polish chipped, rough calluses on her hands. The glow she used to wear like armor had faded. And I was in a new, well-fitted dress. My skin was brighter from skincare, my body lighter from pottery and the gentle exercises Sylvie and I had taken up. But more than any of that, it was the smile on my face, the ease, the peace, the quiet confidence, that made all the difference. Celeste stood there, frozen, studying me like I was someone unfamiliar. "No wonder Richard still thinks about you," she said at last, voice low. You actually look younger than you did before." I smiled lightly, saying nothing. I'd already heard whispers about their fights. But that was their drama now, not mine. "Did you need something?" I asked politely. "If not, I have things to get back to." I turned to leave, but she suddenly stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Evelyn, you're divorced. Can't you stop clinging to him?" Her voice had lost its usual grace. Now it brimmed with bitterness. "He doesn't love you. All he feels for you is guilt and obligation. I'm the one he truly loves." Listening to a woman in her 70s still talk about love and men like they were life's only currency, it struck me as strangely tragic. Celeste had spent her life chasing affection, measuring her worth by whether a man chose her. She never stopped to see who she really was or who she could become. I didn't retaliate. I simply responded, calmly, even kindly. "Celeste, I haven't seen Richard since the day we signed the divorce papers. There's no clinging. That's your imagination." She scoffed. "Then why are you constantly posting those videos? You think I don't know? You want him to see how good you're doing. You want him to regret losing you. Don't pretend you're above it. We're both women. I know exactly what you're trying to do." Suddenly I felt exhausted. There's no use arguing with someone determined to believe their own fantasy. No explanation will ever reach them. I wasn't going to waste more breath. But she wouldn't let it go, her voice growing sharper, her words turning cruel. She lashed out, loud and bitter, until the poised image she'd always projected shattered completely. And in that moment I finally understood, what people call elegance means nothing if it has no foundation. Without character, it's just a well-tailored costume. Her insults grew uglier by the second, until I silently reached for my phone and called Richard. He arrived not long after, just in time to catch Celeste at the peak of her tirade. When I turned and saw him, I paused for a beat. He looked different. Worn-out shirt, rumpled collar, fatigue etched into his face. He was a far cry from the man I used to iron shirts for every morning, the image of a dignified, old-school professor. He noticed my gaze and tugged at his sleeve almost self-consciously. Then he turned to Celeste, his face dark, and said in a low, firm voice, "That's enough." Then he looked at me. "Evelyn," he said softly, "I'm sorry." And that was the final blow for Celeste. "Sorry? You're apologizing to her?" she shrieked. "She's a divorced woman still chasing after you. What, I can't call her out for it? And now you're defending her? Don't tell me you still have feelings for her." She snapped, grabbing Richard's ear in front of everyone, shouting in fury, "You spineless old flirt. Always swaying back and forth. Who could stand a man like you?" Richard, who had spent his entire life carefully maintaining his image, turned scarlet with humiliation. He'd never been publicly scolded like this, certainly not like a child being dragged by the ear. He said nothing, just took her by the arm, red-faced and stiff, and hurried her out of the classroom like a man trying to escape a scene he never imagined himself in. They didn't even look back. I thought the curtain had finally dropped on this absurd little play. But a few days later Julian called. "Mom, something's happened. Dad collapsed. The doctor says it's a stroke. He's in the ICU right now." I paused for a beat, then replied flatly, "I hope he'll be okay." Julian clearly wasn't satisfied with my reaction. "That's it? That's all you have to say? He spent 50 years with you and now that he's sick you don't even care." "Tell me, Julian," I said evenly, "what would you like me to do? Am I supposed to rush to the hospital and perform CPR? Or sob beside his bed to show my loyalty? And let's be honest, if I did get emotional, wouldn't you be the first to accuse me of not being able to let go?" On the other end of the line, Julian gave a sharp, bitter laugh. Don't even bring her up. That woman is useless. She hasn't made a single proper meal in days. The house is a mess. All she does is throw tantrums. No. The moment Dad collapsed, the first thing she asked was how the estate would be divided. God, I regret ever supporting their marriage. I felt nothing but a hollow ache of disappointment. Just weeks ago he was calling Celeste Mom, praising her as graceful, gentle, the picture of elegance. But now that his comfort was threatened, he discarded her without a second thought, called her that woman, like she was some disposable inconvenience. And while I'd never liked Celeste, it wasn't her I pitied now. It was Julian. He didn't understand love. To him, family was a transaction, affection just another form of currency. I hung up without another word. As for Richard, I had no intention of going to see him. That chapter had closed the day we signed those divorce papers. I'd turned the page. Whatever happened to him now belonged to a story I was no longer part of. But Julian wasn't finished. He showed up on my doorstep one morning just as I was heading out for my pottery class, standing there with that awkward, rehearsed look on his face, like a salesman about to pitch a product he didn't quite believe in. He stared at me for a long moment before speaking. Mom, you've really changed. You look younger. I smiled faintly. I guess leaving the wrong person does that to you. His expression flickered. Guilt maybe, or something close. After a few seconds he said quietly, Mom, you really won't go see Dad? He's in serious condition. The doctors say he'll survive, but he may never walk again. My smile faded. My voice was calm, almost indifferent. That's unfortunate. I suppose that means your burden will be a little heavier now. Julian gave a strained laugh. Yeah, and that's sort of why I came. I wanted to ask if you'd consider, maybe, coming back? I turned sharply to look at him, brows raised. Julian, are you out of your mind? Your father and I are divorced. He married Celeste. What exactly do you want me to come back as? He looked away, voice dropping. Celeste filed for divorce the moment she found out Dad would be bedridden. She's demanding half of everything. She was only ever after his money. I raised an eyebrow, quietly amused by the irony. So much for soulmates and eternal love. When faced with real life, illness, dependence, inconvenience, Celeste's romance fell apart faster than it was built. I wasn't surprised. But I knew Julian hadn't come out of guilt or a change of heart. He hadn't come to apologize. He'd come because he needed something. A caregiver. I looked at him coolly. So that's it. You came here to ask me to take care of your father. His face colored slightly, caught in the lie. Then, in typical Julian fashion, he dropped the pretense. Yeah, that's part of it. Dad's completely paralyzed now. Someone has to care for him. Margot and I both work. We've got Leo. We can't just drop everything and stay in the hospital 24/7. Life has to go on. Ah yes. There was. The Julian I knew. The one who calculated affection like a ledger, weighed every emotion against cost and return. I let out a dry laugh. You ever heard of a nurse? He sighed, frustrated. How can we trust a stranger? Dad's used to you, you know his routine, how to manage him. No one else can do it like you. Just help us out this once, for me and Leo, okay? I actually laughed out loud this time. I'd given up so much of my life for him already. Sacrificed, swallowed pride, endured humiliation. And now, after all that, he still saw me as a backup plan. A placeholder. A woman who existed to serve, to be slotted back in when the arrangement no longer suited him. I finally understood. No matter how much I gave to him, I would always just be a tool. An interchangeable piece in the machinery of his life. And I was done being that. Julian, do you really think I owe everyone in this family my entire life? I've spent half my years running this household. Caring for your father, raising you, looking after Leo. And that still isn't enough? You think I should sacrifice whatever time I have left too? Am I not allowed to have a life of my own? And don't you dare throw around words like, for you. You think you still hold any weight in my heart? Honestly, at this point, you matter less to me than the clay pot I just finished in my studio. So don't come knocking on my door again. I have a pottery competition to prepare for. I don't have time to serve some washed-up old man. Julian's face turned a stormy mix of red and pale, his mouth twitching as if he couldn't decide whether to shout or walk away. After a moment of struggling for a comeback, he finally snapped, "You're too old to be entering competitions. Why are you still wasting your time on all this nonsense? I was ready to slap him right then and there. But before I could say a word, a clear, sharp voice cut in from the side. Who says age disqualifies you from competing? Who made the rule that older women should revolve around their families for the rest of their lives? Sylvie walked in with that confident little smile of hers. Evelyn's talented. Of course she deserves to compete. The real question is, why are you, over 30 and still emotionally tethered to your mother, expecting her to clean up your mess? You could stand to learn a thing or two from her. At least she's living like a real person. She walked over and gently took my hand. Don't listen to him, she said softly. Do what you love. It's never too late to start. I couldn't help but laugh. I gave her a grateful nod, warmth swelling in my chest. Julian, humiliated and furious, slammed the door behind him as he stormed out. And for the first time in a long time I felt nothing but peace. I thought he'd finally given up. But a few days later he sent Margot to my door. She came in with polite small talk, offering a smile and asking about my health, but noticeably avoided the real reason she was here. Not a single word about Richard or taking care of Dad. Instead, as she watched me quietly shaping clay at the wheel, something changed in her expression. A softness, a glint of wistful admiration. Evelyn, she said gently. To be honest, Julian sent me here to try and convince you to come back. But looking at you now, if I actually said those words aloud, I'd feel like a complete asshole. You look peaceful. Happy. I've never seen you like this before. Not once in all those years in that house. You were always so tired, so heavy with everything you carried. Her voice was warm, sincere, almost apologetic. And honestly, your courage to start over. It's inspiring. It's made me think about a lot of things. She gave me a soft nod, like she'd made a decision quietly inside herself, then turned and left without another word. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Until a few days later Julian called again, his voice full of fury. Mom, what the hell did you say to Margot? Now she's talking about divorce. He ranted on, accusing me of poisoning her mind, claiming I'd filled her head with ideas, and complaining that Margot isn't as obedient as she used to be. The only thing he didn't do was reflect on himself. I didn't bother responding. I just let him rage. Because men like him, you could tell them the truth 100 times and they still wouldn't hear a single word. Soon after, Margot and Julian finalized their divorce. She left with Leo and didn't look back. Celeste also divorced Richard, not without taking half his assets with her. And so the once proud Hart household was reduced to 2 men. One paralyzed in bed, the other selfish to his core. Later, Richard began sending people to reach out to me, asking if I'd be willing to see him. I hesitated for a long time. But eventually I said yes. When I stood at his bedside, I was surprised by how calm I felt. The man lying before me was no longer the polished, eloquent professor I had once married. He was frail now, his face sunken, his eyes dull, his body a hollow shell of who he used to be. He looked up at me, voice weak but sincere. Evelyn, you came. I thought I'd never see you again. These past weeks I've been thinking about everything. All the years we spent together. And I finally realized, I loved you. I did. I was too selfish to see it. I thought you'd never leave, so I kept hurting you. I didn't ask you here to beg forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I didn't want to die without saying, I'm sorry. I listened quietly. But there was no hatred left in me. No anger. Only peace. I nodded politely, offered a few kind, distant words and then turned and walked away. That evening I brewed a pot of red tea, polished the little clay pieces on my balcony until they gleamed, and lit a soft candle scented with sandalwood. As dusk settled, Sylvie knocked on the door. She burst in with excitement, waving a flyer in her hand. Big news. The Community Pottery Association is going to the State Handcraft Festival. And guess what? Your vase was selected for the Excellence Exhibition. I couldn't help but laugh. Looks like this old woman still has a few tricks up her sleeve. Sylvie grinned. No tricks. You're the coolest one in our whole group. I shook my head, chuckling, then turned toward the golden light spilling in through the window. The days passed gently. I started teaching classes at the festival, demonstrating wheel throwing, glazing, trimming. Young women would gather around, hands dusted with clay, listening as I guided them through the art. Sometimes I held little storytelling sessions too. Life from scratch, we called them. I talked about starting over. About marriage, sacrifice, rediscovery, and how even the messiest clay could be shaped into something beautiful. People said they loved the sound of my voice. Said it calmed them, made them feel seen. Sylvie suggested I start a podcast. Your life is better than any drama series, she said. And every word you say carries weight. I agreed almost without thinking. And just like that, I became a pottery podcast host. I spoke about my life. About the years lost, the courage found, the hands that shaped not just clay but resilience. I talked about the heartbreak and the healing, the silence and the strength. And I spoke of how pottery taught me that even shattered things could be remade. After every recording, I'd place the freshly glazed cups from that day by the window, letting the light catch their curves and edges. They were my stories, my memories, my new beginning. I no longer needed anyone's approval. I no longer made space for compromise. And finally I understood. The most important thing in life isn't who you lived for. It's whether, even just once, you truly lived for yourself. And now I am. Truly, fully, beautifully alive.